What's up everybody, my name is Sawyerhartman and today I have a Canon 1DX Mark II in one hand and a full-frame mirrorless EOS-R in the other hand. And just like you, I'm curious which is the better camera. On with the video. What's up everybody and welcome back to yet another episode. Today I have my full workhorse and just beast of a camera, Canon 1DX Mark II with a 24 megapixel image sensor, coming in just under $6,000 up against the brand new full frame mirrorless EOS-R 30 megapixel beast of a camera from Canon that's coming in at $2,200. Now with a price difference as big as the one between these two cameras, we can go ahead and assume that the 1DX Mark II is going to be a far superior camera. However, after a couple weeks of using it, I'm really not so sure anymore. So today we are looking to answer two questions. The first question, does the new EOS-R hold up to the 1DX Mark II as a professional level camera? And then secondly, why would someone spend $4,000 extra to buy a 1DX Mark II when they could just buy the EOS-R? Those are the two questions we're trying to answer. Now let's just get on with the testing and see how these two cameras can hold up against each other. So for the first test of this video, we're going to jump straight into video quality and see if we can spot some differences between the two cameras. So for our first test, we put both cameras in 24 frames a second at 1080p, and honestly, it was impossible to spot any difference between the two cameras. I mean, if you really want to get specific, the 1DX seemed to have a little bit more dynamic range over the punchy image from the EOS-R, but really that was it. Now, it is worth noting that both cameras were set to the same white balance, the same settings on manual mode, as well as the same picture profile within the camera. So for the sake of saving an argument, both of these cameras are set up exactly the same, so don't try to blame it on the picture profile. So the next test was putting both cameras in 24 frames a second at 4K resolution, and this is where we really started seeing the first difference of the video. The EOS-R has a 1.8 times crop factor when shooting in 4K, which makes the image noticeably more pushed in. Meanwhile, the 1DX Mark II only has a 1.3 crop factor when shooting in 4K, and this difference is huge if you're a videographer looking to utilize 4K content all the time. Nobody wants to be shooting at a 1.8 crop factor forever. But also for some reason, the EOS-R image in 4K seemed almost too sharp and contrasty. It looked very digital, which is not a good thing if you're looking to capture cinematic footage like I always am. Now, when it comes to capturing slow motion footage, these two cameras are not comparable at all. The 1DX can shoot 4K 60 frames a second and shoot 120 frames a second slow motion in 1080p without sacrificing any autofocus. Like, the autofocus is perfect in both settings. Whereas on the other hand, the EOS-R can shoot 120 frames a second in only 720p with terrible autofocus, and they don't even give you any options to shoot anything higher than 30 frames in 4K. So there is no 4K 60, there is no 4K slow motion on the EOS-R. The highest you're gonna be able to do is 60 frames at 1080, which is pretty standard for like any camera. Now, autofocus is actually a different story completely because both the 1DX Mark II and the EOS-R have incredibly fast and reliable autofocus when it comes to video. But while the 1DX is noticeably faster at finding focus, surprisingly, the EOS-R is better at keeping focus once you have it. Trust me, this is a massive shock to me because I had always worshipped the autofocus on the 1DX, but maybe the EOS-R isn't that far behind. Now, only the Canon EOS-R has an in-camera digital stabilization to help try to like smooth out your footage. The 1DX doesn't even offer any type of stabilization at all. But when we tried it out, the stabilization in the EOS-R really only seems to be working when you hold the camera perfectly still. The second you start trying to follow your subject or move the camera around, the stabilization actually adds more jerkiness than your hand probably would have in the beginning. And then the last video test we had for these two cameras was actually to see how they could handle in low light situations. We started at a base ISO of around 640 and incrementally bumped both cameras up until they noticeably started to fall apart. And shockingly enough, both images were somehow still quite usable up to about 20,000 ISO. Now, the Canon EOS-R image actually seemed to break down a little quicker than the 1DX, getting pixelated in both the shadows and around the hairline. Whereas the 1DX image held super strong, it just started introducing more and more noise. And secondly, the 1DX seemed to have a much more natural grain than the EOS-R. I don't know if it's because the EOS-R has a mirrorless sensor or whatnot, but the 1DX grain as the ISO got higher looked a lot more natural and usable than that digital pixelation we started seeing in the EOS-R. So moving into the photography related side of our test, we decided to start by comparing the number of frames each camera can take within a second, which isn't even fair. The EOS-R is limited to 8 frames a second in certain autofocus modes and only 6 frames a second in other autofocus modes, whereas the 1DX Mark II holds fast at a blazing 16 photos a second, and you can just shoot that literally until your card is full. We then tested the photo autofocus of both cameras and were completely shocked. The Canon 1DX Mark II, just like we had assumed, did not get out of focus for even one photo. We had our model do 2 tests, walk towards the camera and run towards the camera. The 1DX was flawless in both, giving us crystal clear, sharp images for every single photo taken. But what shocked us most is the EOS-R had almost equally impressive autofocus skills. Now, of course, the EOS-R is only taking half as many photos as the 1DX, but I was still shocked because I thought the 1DX was going to crush this camera when it came to photo autofocus, and I am pleasantly surprised. So the last test we had to perform came down to the color, the dynamic range, and the overall image quality of the raw images taken on both of these cameras. So using the same settings, the same lens, and the same lighting, we took the same image on both cameras and threw them into Lightroom to see how they did. Now, for an extra $4,000, I honestly fully believe that the 1DX Mark II should take a much better image than the Canon EOS-R, but after about 15 minutes of looking through the photos, I found myself having to go look at which photo was which because they were pretty much identical. Now, the EOS-R seemed to be a little bit sharper. That could be because it has an extra 6 megapixel, but the 1DX Mark II seemed to have a little bit better dynamic range, giving us softer highlights and not so crunchy shadows, which makes for not such a crunchy image. Now, please remember these were both shot in this same picture profile, but for the most part, both of the photos were freaking identical. But that brings us to the first question we asked in the beginning of this video. Does the EOS-R hold up to the 1DX Mark II as a professional level camera? But the honest truth is, when it comes down to photo and video quality, the 1DX and the EOS-R are almost identical cameras. The EOS-R just has a couple limitations that the 1DX does not. And that brings us to the second question we asked in the beginning of this video. What would bring someone to spend an extra $4,000 on a 1DX Mark II when the cameras are already pretty much the same? Well, it wasn't actually until I made this video that I really realized the 1DX Mark II is actually a specialty camera, and the few features that it has over the EOS-R is actually what you're paying for. Things like shooting 120 frames a second in 1080 with perfect autofocus, or shooting 4K 60 frames, or even the ability to shoot a blazingly fast 16 photo a second burst mode. The 1DX also, in my opinion, has a more cinematic image, whereas the EOS-R is kind of a little digital. So to answer the question, I mean, if you're a sports photographer or a filmmaker making slow motion cinematic films, it's not even really a question. The 1DX Mark II is a far superior camera. But if you're a YouTube creator talking to camera, or an Instagrammer just trying to capture the memories from your travels, the EOS-R is actually the absolute perfect camera for you. Not to mention the EOS-R is smaller, lighter, it has a flip out screen, and has some features like time-lapse mode that the 1DX does not. So moving forward into the future, I'm going to be using my Canon EOS-R for all of my sit-down talking to camera YouTube videos, and I will still be using my Canon 1DX Mark II for all my slow motion, cinematic content, and kind of film work. And if you have any questions on these cameras or thoughts on other cameras you think I should know about, please leave them down in the comments below. I would love to start a little bit of discussion with you guys on this. But other than that, I really hope this video helped you get a better understanding of these two cameras and kind of figure out where they might fit into your current workflow. If you did enjoy and want to subscribe, I make a brand new film and photography related video every single Thursday and Sunday, and I would love to have you here as part of the family. And I hope you guys have been enjoying all the content from the last few months. I want to thank you for sharing it with all of your camera loving friends and on Instagram. This channel is growing fast again, and I could not be happier, so thank you very much. And well, that's it. If you are new here and you've never heard this before, this is how we end the videos, but before you go, remember, stay motivated, stay inspired, and never stop creating, and I'll see you guys on Sunday. Peace.